My feet are moving again. I tell them to stop, but they don't. At first, I blame the heat. The kind that presses down on the street and makes even standing feel like effort. I blame the poor sleep, the thin meals, the constant tension that never quite leaves. I lean my shoulder against the wall, trying to steady myself, but my legs pull me away as if the wall is holding me back from something I can't see. My calves tighten until they burn. My ankles snap forward, step after step, like they've been given instructions my mind never received. People begin to notice. At first, there's laughter, nervous, uncertain. The kind people use when something feels strange but still harmless. Then the laughter thins into confusion. Someone tells me to stop. Someone else makes the sign of the cross. I try to speak, but my breath comes out shallow and uneven. Sweat runs down my neck. Every movement hurts, but stopping feels impossible, like trying to hold your breath when your lungs refuse. Across the street, I see someone else moving the same way. Not dancing with joy. Not celebrating. Convulsing. Then another person joins them. Then another. And suddenly, it's clear this isn't just happening to me. What you're hearing is not imagination. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, people began dancing without control. Some for hours. Some for days. Some until their bodies gave out completely. This was not a festival. It was not a celebration. It was a public emergency unfolding in full view, and no one understood what they were witnessing. Strasbourg at the start of the 16th century was already under strain. On the surface, it was a prosperous city, a center of trade along the Rhine, busy with merchants, craftsmen, and guilds. But beneath that order was pressure. Years of poor harvests had driven food prices high. Bread, the foundation of daily life, became scarce and expensive. Hunger was common, even among working families. Malnutrition weakened bodies and dulled resilience. Disease was constant. Plague outbreaks were recent memory, not distant history. Smallpox and syphilis moved through the population. Fevers came and went. Infant mortality was high. Death was familiar. Most people lived close to the edge, one bad season away from collapse. Fear was not an occasional emotion in Strasbourg. It was the background noise of daily life. Religious anxiety deepened that fear. This was the early Reformation era. Long-held beliefs were being challenged, but nothing stable had replaced them. People worried not only about survival, but about salvation. Illness could be disease, punishment, or curse, sometimes all at once. Saints were believed to have real influence over the human body. Certain afflictions were associated with certain saints, and among them was Saint Vitus, long linked in popular belief with involuntary movement and convulsions. In that worldview, the boundary between physical illness and spiritual affliction was thin. Into this environment, something began that no one could explain and no authority could immediately control. In July of 1518, a woman stepped into the street and began to move. Her name was recorded later as Frau Trophia. What mattered most was not who she was, but what people saw. She did not dance to music. She did not smile. She did not invite others to join. According to witnesses, her movement looked forced and relentless. At first, neighbors assumed it was a strange performance or perhaps an act of devotion. Some thought she was praying with her body. Others thought she was drunk or seeking attention. But she did not stop. She danced through the day. She danced through the night. When morning came, she was still moving. Her feet were swollen. Her legs trembled. Her face was tight with exhaustion and pain. Accounts say she begged for help, begged to be allowed to rest, but her body refused. People gathered because people always gather when something unusual happens. They stared. They argued. They speculated. Was she cursed? Was she ill? Was this a sign? And then something far more dangerous happened. Someone else began to move. Not because they touched her. Not because they shared food or drink. They began after watching. Within days, others joined. Men and women. Young and old. The numbers were not overwhelming at first, which is part of what made the event so unsettling. It grew slowly, just fast enough that people could convince themselves it would stop. But it didn't. The dancing spread through sight and fear, not contact. Chroniclers took notice. Officials took notice. Written accounts described bodies twisting and leaping without rest. Dancers cried out in agony even as their limbs continued. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again minutes later. Ankles bruised. Feet bled. Bodies shook uncontrollably. Accusations followed. Some believed the dancers were cursed. Others believed they were being punished by God. A few accused them of faking, until the injuries made that impossible to maintain. And still, the number of dancers increased. At this point, the city believed it could manage the situation. Strasbourg was governed by a council that valued order. Disorder threatened trade, safety, and reputation. A growing group of people convulsing and dancing in public was not just disturbing, it was dangerous. Crowds gathered. Rumors spread. Fear multiplied. The council needed an explanation. And they needed a solution. They turned to physicians, confident this was a medical problem that could be treated. That decision would change everything. Once the physicians were consulted, the city moved quickly. Strasbourg's leaders believed that uncertainty was more dangerous than action, and the doctors had offered an explanation that fit the medical thinking of the time. According to their diagnosis, the dancers suffered from overheated blood. Too much internal heat, they believed, caused agitation and restlessness. The solution followed logically from that belief. Movement would exhaust the excess heat. If the dancers kept moving long enough, the sickness would burn itself out. It was a confident answer, delivered with authority, and the city accepted it. Acting on this advice, Strasbourg intervened. Wooden stages were built in public squares. Open spaces were cleared. Musicians were hired to provide rhythm. What had been frightening and chaotic was now organized. The intention was control. The effect was something else entirely. The stages became focal points. People gathered, drawn by fear, curiosity, and the need to understand what was happening. The musicians played steadily, believing rhythm would guide movement and prevent injury. Instead, the music did something far more powerful. It synchronized bodies. Rhythm has a unique influence on the nervous system. It regulates breathing, influences heart rate, and can override conscious control of movement. Even people who are not dancing often find their bodies responding to a beat without realizing it. In Strasbourg, rhythm became reinforcement. The dancers, already exhausted and distressed, now had structure for their movement. And those who watched absorbed a clear message: this behavior was recognized, accepted, and even encouraged by authority. More people began to dance. Some joined after watching for hours. Others joined after returning day after day, unable to pull themselves away from the spectacle. The city had unintentionally legitimized the outbreak. What had once seemed inexplicable now appeared to have a place in the process. That mattered in a society where official action carried enormous weight. As the days passed, the consequences became impossible to ignore. The dancers were not trained performers. They were ordinary people, many already weakened by hunger, illness, and stress. Dancing for hours on stone streets took a severe toll. Some collapsed from exhaustion and did not rise again. Others suffered strokes or heart attacks, their bodies unable to endure the strain. Contemporary accounts describe people dying mid-movement, their legs giving out beneath them as crowds looked on. Faces twisted in pain. Limbs shook uncontrollably. Feet were bruised, swollen, bleeding. This was not joy. It was agony made public. The music did not stop when people fell. The stages did not disappear when injuries mounted. For a time, the response continued, driven by the belief that exhaustion would bring relief. Instead, exhaustion brought death. Reports from the period vary, as medieval records often do, but several accounts suggest that multiple people were dying each day at the height of the outbreak. Whether every number is precise matters less than what it represents. The situation had crossed a line. What was once strange and frightening had become lethal. And now the city faced a new problem. It was no longer just dealing with disorder. It was dealing with responsibility. Panic followed. The city council realized the medical solution was failing, and failing publicly. The stages that were meant to demonstrate control now symbolized helplessness. The music that was meant to guide movement now sounded cruel. Officials reversed course. Music was banned. Stages were dismantled. The dances were removed from public view and taken away from the city center. This shift marked a critical turning point. Strasbourg abandoned medicine and turned to religion. Many of the afflicted were taken outside the city walls to religious shrines, especially those associated with Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus had long been linked, in popular belief, to involuntary movement and convulsions. If he could curse, he could cure. The dances were prayed over. They were sprinkled with holy water. Rituals were performed meant to calm bodies and break afflictions. Just as importantly, they were isolated from crowds. The spectacle ended. Slowly, the dancing began to stop. Not all at once. Not miraculously. But gradually, as attention faded and reinforcement disappeared. By late summer, the outbreak had ended. Strasbourg returned to something resembling normal life. The streets quieted. The crowds dispersed. The stages were gone. But the memory of what had happened did not vanish. And neither did the question that followed everyone who had witnessed it. What had actually caused this? The city had tried medicine and failed. It had tried organization and made things worse. It had tried ritual and seen improvement, but not understanding. The answers were not obvious, and they would not be agreed upon for centuries. Some people blamed sin. Others blamed divine punishment. Some blamed food, environment, or fate. What everyone agreed on was that the event defied easy explanation. And that uncertainty is where the story truly begins to deepen. Because when historians later returned to Strasbourg's records, they noticed patterns that did not fit a simple physical illness. The outbreak did not spread through contact. It spread through observation. It intensified when it was publicly acknowledged and organized. It faded when attention was removed. Those details mattered. They pointed toward an explanation that was far more unsettling than poison or plague. An explanation rooted not in contamination, but in the human mind and its relationship with fear, belief, and authority. To understand that explanation, we need to look beyond Strasbourg's streets and ask a different question. Why would stress take this form at all? Why movement? Why dancing? And why did it happen here, at this moment, in this city? The answers lie not only in medieval medicine, but in human psychology, and they reveal why the dancing plague of 1518 still matters today. To understand what truly caused the dancing plague of 1518, we have to move past the idea that there must be a single, simple answer. Events like this rarely have one cause. Instead, they emerge from a convergence of conditions, each one intensifying the next. When historians and scientists later returned to Strasbourg's records, they found clues not in what spread through bodies, but in what spread through minds. One of the earliest explanations proposed was poisoned grain. Rye was a staple food in medieval Europe, and it was vulnerable to contamination by a fungus known as ergot. Ergot can cause convulsions, muscle spasms, hallucinations, and intense physical distress. In some outbreaks, it had produced frightening symptoms across entire communities. On the surface, it seemed like a promising explanation. People eat contaminated bread, their nervous systems are affected, and strange behavior follows. But when examined closely, the theory begins to fall apart. Ergot poisoning typically incapacitates people. Victims become violently ill, weak, and often bedridden. Sustained, coordinated movement for days does not fit the usual pattern. Ergot also tends to affect groups who share the same food supply at the same time. The Strasbourg outbreak, by contrast, appears to have spread gradually, person by person, through observation rather than shared meals. Ergot may have existed in the environment, as it often did, but it cannot explain why people began dancing after watching others, or why the behavior intensified when it was publicly encouraged and faded when attention was removed. A different explanation fits those patterns far more closely. Mass psychogenic illness. Also known as mass sociogenic illness, it describes situations where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms across groups of people. These symptoms are real. The pain is real. The lack of control is real. What spreads is not a pathogen, but fear, expectation, and belief. Strasbourg in 1518 was primed for such an outbreak. Hunger weakened bodies. Disease created constant anxiety. Religious belief framed suffering as meaningful and contagious. When Frau Troffea began to move, she did not just display a symptom. She displayed a possibility. Others watched and wondered if it could happen to them. That question alone can be enough to change how the body behaves. Under extreme stress, the nervous system becomes hyper-alert. Muscles tense. Sensations are amplified. Normal bodily signals are misinterpreted as threats. A tremor becomes a sign. A spasm becomes confirmation. Once the behavior is visible, it becomes socially reinforced. The city's response intensified that reinforcement. By building stages and hiring musicians, authorities gave the outbreak structure and legitimacy. The message, however unintended, was clear. This behavior was recognized. It had a place. It was being managed. In a society where authority shaped belief, that mattered. Attention led to expectation. Expectation led to symptoms. Symptoms led to more attention. A feedback loop formed, and the city became trapped inside it. The role of music cannot be ignored. Rhythm has a powerful influence on the human nervous system. It can regulate breathing, synchronize movement, and override conscious control. Even people who are not dancing often find their bodies responding to a beat without realizing it. In Strasbourg, music did more than accompany the dancers. It sustained them. It gave their movement a pattern and endurance their bodies might not otherwise have had. When the music stopped and the stages were dismantled, the loop weakened. Without rhythm, without crowds, without constant observation, the nervous system began to settle. This explains why the outbreak ended gradually rather than suddenly. Bodies do not reset instantly. They calm as their environment changes. Strasbourg was not the only place where this kind of phenomenon occurred. Earlier centuries recorded smaller outbreaks of compulsive movement and convulsive behavior across parts of Europe, often during times of famine, disease, or religious upheaval. These events were sometimes linked to saints believed to have power over bodily afflictions, especially Saint Vitus. The details varied, but the pattern was consistent. Extreme stress, shared belief, public visibility, and eventually, collapse. These outbreaks were rare, but they followed a recognizable human script. When pressure builds without relief, the body finds a way to express it. Even in the modern world, mass psychogenic illness still occurs. In schools, factories, and communities, outbreaks of unexplained symptoms have been documented without any identifiable physical cause. Students develop tics. Workers experience dizziness or fainting spells. Entire groups report nausea, headaches, or trembling. Investigations often find no toxins, no infections, no mechanical failures. What they do find is stress, fear, and close social contact. The symptoms look different because modern culture provides different scripts for expressing distress. But the mechanism is the same. The body becomes the messenger when the mind cannot articulate the problem. This is why the dancing plague of 1518 is not just a medieval curiosity. It is a case study in how belief, environment, and authority interact with human biology. It shows how well-intentioned decisions can amplify a crisis when they fail to account for psychological dynamics. Strasbourg's leaders were not foolish or cruel. They acted within the limits of their knowledge, trying to impose order on something unprecedented. Their mistake was assuming that structure alone could solve a problem rooted in fear. The dancers themselves were not mad, possessed, or performing. They were people under extraordinary strain whose bodies responded in extraordinary ways. When we strip away the strange imagery and unfamiliar beliefs, what remains is deeply human. A city under pressure. A population pushed to its limits. A collective response that no one planned and no one could easily stop. The streets of Strasbourg eventually fell quiet. The stages disappeared. The music faded. Life moved on. But the event left behind a lesson that still matters. Stress does not remain invisible forever. When it cannot be spoken, it is expressed. When it cannot be resolved, it is embodied. Sometimes that expression takes the form of violence. Sometimes it takes the form of withdrawal. And sometimes, as it did in Strasbourg, it takes the form of movement that refuses to stop. History does not always announce itself with wars or disasters that reshape maps. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single person stepping into the street and beginning to move. And then another person moves. And another. Until an entire city is forced to confront the limits of its understanding. The dancing plague of 1518 endures not because it is strange, but because it reveals something uncomfortable about us. Under enough pressure, the line between mind and body, between belief and action, can blur. And when that happens, history does not scream. It moves. And sometimes, it dances.